Om Namah Shivaya, Sushri Appa.
Yes, Sushri Akar.
This meeting is being recorded.
So we'll start the session after just give me a minute.
Sir Randeji,
Yeah.
my network is slightly unstable, it seems. In case it gets disconnected, I'll log in back again.
Okay. So do you have any presentation today?
Yes. So
Okay. So
I
you are
will.
now co-host.
Okay.
You are now
So I
co-host.
can.
And I
Okay.
request there are some persons who are in our waiting room. So I request
Yeah, we'll
mention
wait
the time.
for a few minutes. Meantime, I'm also sending you the file so that in case I find some problem in sharing, you can share at your.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just sending it right.
So thank you so much, dear and respected friend. Today is a very special day. Today we are going to organize this dialogue of Swadhyaya Chakra Circle for Co-Learning and Mutual Study. We choose the topic called Poetry and Pathways of Self and Social Transformation. As you know, on 21st of the March, we will celebrate World's Poetry Day. So this dialogue is a kind of orientation of celebration of that particular day. And on behalf of Vishwanidhan Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai, I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, welcome the chair of today's session, Dr. Jernail Singh Anand. I welcome a speaker of today's session, Dr. Sushri Mishra. I welcome discussant of today's session, our mentor, and I think there is noise from the side of our participant. I request respected participant to mute themselves that we can avoid disruptions. And let me give a brief introduction to respected chair of today's session, Dr. Jernail Singh Anand, who does not need any introduction at all. He is a creative thinker, very inspiring soul, and a creative writer and a deep poet. He is founding father of a trust called, he's a chairman of Azad Foundation, and he has a deep interest in development of new sort of institutions around the world. And currently he is pursuing the idea of University of Ethics, which is a very beginning stage. In terms of qualification, he has honorary degree. He has been a teacher and mentor of thousands of students, and he motivated many poets. He has written more than 150 books, and he continuously inspiring us through his continuous sadhana. I welcome Dr. Jernail Singh Anand for chairing of today's session. I welcome Dr. Sushri Appa. One of the good introduction, I would say, Dr. Sushri Sangeeta Mishra is our co-nurturer of Vishwanidhan Center for Asian Blossoming. She is a very deep poet, a scholar, editor, and corporate executive. She writes poetry in both English and Odia language. Her journey of poetry is very, very inspiring for all of us. Her poetry published in many languages, including French, Russian, Nepali, Hebrew, Chinese. Currently, she has finished her PhD, and being a public finance worker, she works in private finance, but she has good orientation of seeking knowledge with poetry and philosophy. So thank you, Dr. Sushri Sangeeta Mishra ji, for accepting our invitation to share thought on the very topic, poetry and the task of poetry. I welcome Anantagiri and all friends. So first I would like to invite Jernail Singh Anand to give a kind of chair remark because of his health condition. We request him to initiate the dialogue, and he will join. We'll also invite him at the end of the session, but for giving a kind of introduction of the topic. He himself is a poet, so his poetry is inspiring for all of us. So the topic is very, very important. So I request Dr. Jernail Singh Anand to share his thought on the very topic. Please unmute yourself.
Thanks a lot, Randhirji. And I feel really great to be in the company of learned souls, great minds, and meeting Dr. Sushri Sangeeta Mishra is a matter of great joy and pride for me. I'm thankful to Vishwanidhan Center for Asian Blossoming, its mentor, Dr. Anantagiri and Randhirji, for giving me a chance to be before you to initiate this dialogue, which is very important. As a poet, I always feel that poetry can be the saving grace of this civilization, which is otherwise, deteriorating. So we are addressing a basic question about poetry, how it impacts the poet. When we say poetry and pathways of self, it means how poetry affects the poet, and then social transformation, then man's social environment, the milieu where he is, how it affects both of these things. And it may look a very strange thing that most of the people look upon poetry as a hobby. Just have a look at the people who are writing in your circle. Most of them are working people here or there. Sometimes, as a hobby, they write poetry. And you don't find full-time versifiers. How many people are simply writing poetry, not doing anything else? I think it's very few. But poetry has, as an art, has a lasting influence on man's self, as well as his social milieu. When we read poetry written by other poets, so mostly we are reading poetry or we are creating poetry. In both the cases, it arouses a sublime passion which is an elevating experience in itself. Lovers of poetry invariably possess soft souls, and they show a greater sensitivity towards life than those who have no connect with poetry. Such sensitivity is missing from people studying workaday subjects like science, commerce, engineering. And those who write poetry most of the time are in a state of ecstasy. And they try to transplant that ecstatic moment through words into the heart of their readers. Thus, poetry connects us to the creative forces of life and has an uplifting effect on human thought and human perception. These sublime thoughts further impact society as well. How one can remain unaffected when poets in their verses are inviting them for a change of thought patterns and human perspectives. But we see that poetry has to contend with other genres in a world marked by great competition. The literary world is there is a lot of competition, and space which is given to poetry is very small. Still, the poets hold on to higher values of life where money does not matter. People write poetry for the sake of poetry, not for making fast buck. Money or no money, they do not bother. And it is because of this passionate involvement in which man's whole being is involved that poets do not bother how the world looks at them. You know, poets are sometimes considered mad people also. They feel what they feel, they say it. Perhaps this is the reason poetry is considered a one-way ticket to the poor house. Just go back in history, look at great poets who suffered poverty, pangs of poverty. There are hardly full-time poets who are running their families on the income of their verses. This is the point I want to underline. You will not find many poets who are living on the income from their verses. Try to find out if you can. Poetry, however exalted it is, still remains a part-time passion. I'm sorry to say. It is a part-time passion with its practitioners. Now, there is the aspect of loving poetry. We all love poetry. There are so many people who love poetry. But there are very few who are living by it, as I have just mentioned. Living by means living on poetry. Then there is the third stage, and this is entirely different, and that is living poetry. Loving poetry, living by poetry, and now we come to living poetry. Generally, what we see, how we approach poetry in general sense. People are reciting poetry. There are poetry recitation contests in colleges here and there. We are taking an academic interest. We think that poetry is an academic art. Suppose what happens? There is a prompt, and then you start writing poetry. Emotion or no emotion, come up with a composition and send it for a competition. It is good for beginners or learners in initial stages. In colleges and universities also, poetry is taught for the sake of scores in the examinations. Then one more important issue here I want to underline is why I call it academic. We are writing against dowry. We are writing against female feticide. We are writing against unemployment. We are writing against social inequality. Go to the poetry symposium. You will see people are writing against these things. Well, we write well. And when we recite our poem, there is great wah-wah, thumping of desks. There may be a prize too, but matter ends here. Now see what happens. Why I say living poetry. When we are to get married, we take dowry. Even poets who write against dowry, when it comes to their marriage, they take dowry and give dowry. We celebrate the birth of a male child over a female child. We do not bother about unemployment. All those issues which we raised in our poems suddenly lose steam and we become satisfied simply by raising them on the stage. So this is what I call academic art. We have reduced poetry to an academic art. We are not involved in it. The issue is living poetry. Now, if we say something in our poems, we should be prepared to live those principles too. Otherwise, the words that we use are no more than corpses. In other words, poetry needs commitment. Poetry needs your soulful involvement. It is not only a passion, nor a profession. It is a matter of faith. It is a sacred trust with the muse. Can we afford to break that trust? While talking about issues of poetry, I must stress, although the poet most of the time talks about I, even Wordsworth always says, I went there, I saw there. Yet, I think the general issues which he brings into focus, he may start with I, but he ends with something, some generalizations when he tries to say something about other people, other issues. So I believe that only that poetry survives which concerns human lives. Love for the self is understandable, but poetry is a waste of words. If it does not touch the lives of the people, if it has nothing to say about the wrongs and injustices which are being done to the poor and the helpless. Every poet has a dream, and this dream is to create a world of equality, love, compassion, understanding, in which the well-being of the unfortunate is ensured. In this world of the cutthroat, it is only the poet, nobody else. Only the poet can harbor such a dream and work for its realization. Poetry must have social transformation at its center. If we look back into the Romantic period, we find the late 18th century poets like William Blake using poetry as a tool for social change and protest. His poem Jerusalem attacks industrial revolution and pins its faith that England can be converted into God's paradise. Similarly, Shelley's poem England in 1819 is his most angry and politically direct poem, which concludes by giving a glimmer of hope that out of stormy events a better world may be born. In the same way, we remember Tennyson's Ulysses when he says, "It is not too late to see a newer world." He stresses on to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So is Matthew Arnold's Progress, which questions the idea of progress if it comes at the expense of forgetting our core values. So poets belong to a different world, a world of the mind and the spirit in which you tend to lose your identity and merge into a universal spirit. You feel you are part of the cosmos. This connect with the eternal values of life is the central passion of a poet. All else comes later. Poetry is rooted in truth. Poetry is rooted in human compassion. A poet cannot be corrupted. A poet cannot be purchased. Poetry is the only art that can be depended upon to wash the world of its impurities. We need not only have very, very clean bodies, we need clean minds, clean perceptions, and most important, a clean consciousness. Poetry is the only detergent that can bring about that qualitative change in human perceptions. But our problem is we want success. We want to study subjects which can ensure instant jobs and then lead to wealth creation. We think the more our possessions, the greater will be our joy. Wealth is the parameter of social success, but it leads to a lot of misery. Those whom we deprive of their dues lead miserable lives. And we too, when we take more than we can chew, find the burden too heavy very soon. But it is quite late by the time we realize man does not need much to be happy. Happiness is what we should aspire for. Our only poetry or literature can make people realize this hard fact of life. What we are teaching and preaching in universities are subjects which can bring us jobs and a decent living, but no university teaches us where to stop, where to think of others, where to turn inwards, where to stop loving yourself, where to start loving the other whom we have hated and exploited. No university teaches us. Only literature can connect you to the creative forces of the universe. We have to start loving nature. Nature's most distinguishing fact is that it remains incorruptible and it retains its balance, which we have lost. Mankind has lost both virtues because we have turned into bellies and stomachs supported by brains and forgotten that man does not live by bread alone. He has a heart which feels and a soul which works like a CCTV camera. Let us activate these dormant virtues of mankind. Surely there will be a transformation, a change, when a man with a new wiring system will need to rewire man's mind. When man with a new wiring system will come into existence, when priorities will change and thinking patterns will change, in this changed scenario, now mark my words, poets will be taken as advisors by the political administrators. Just look at any country, anywhere, if any poet is taken as an advisor by any political establishment, they are just ignored. Shelley said poets are unacknowledged legislators of the world. So friends, let us have a society which acknowledges their powers of perception and they are made legislators in fact. So we talked to Randhir Gautam. I would like to share a poem with you, which I wrote day before yesterday. The poem is, you can see how although I'm talking of mythology, I have to talk of today also. If I talk only of mythology, I am becoming irrelevant unless I talk of the present times. So the poem is, Mahabharata is still on. So you can relate to this easily, but I want to point out one important point in it. There is a word, asvasthama moment. I hope all the Indian people know what is asvasthama moment. When Krishnji, made Yudhishthir tell a lie. If they had not told the lie, then Mahabharata would not have been won by them. So that is I called Asvasthama moment. It will be coming up in this. I just made it clear. It is wrong to think Mahabharata belongs to a gone by epic. It has lingered into our modern times, and we are still in the thick of this great battle, which proved good was more powerful, and it was thought it finished evil. It was. The battle of Mahabharata is still raging. The Kauravian army has come to life again. Duryodhana is still reigning supreme, and you can see on his side great warriors, great powers, and great intelligence. The only thing that has changed now is that the armies of the Pandavas have further shrunk. You can see, goodness, it is shrinking. The armies of the Pandavas have further shrunk, and most disconcerting thing is they are not supported by good Shakti, the power of the good. Krishnji, the Lord, is not with them, who in that great epic battle caused the Asvasthama moment. It was Lord Krishna who created that Asvasthama moment. He is not with the powers of the good today. Pandavas have powers, but lack the killer instinct, which the Lord's presence lent to them in that great war. Just imagine, in the absence of Krishna, what would have happened? What would have been the result of the war? Now things are stranger. Things are stranger. People are unable to distinguish between Pandavas and Kauravas. People are unable to distinguish between Kauravas and Pandavas, as Kaurava heroes have learned all the nuances of the language the Lord spoke. And they wear Bandovian masks, confusing the masses. With the expanding armies of Kauravas, there is terror in the divine camp. Angels rue why good has not been able to brace itself to fight evil. Angels are worried. Why good is unable to face evil? And why today again they need intervention of the Lord? The swords are clanging, bleeding corpses covering the earth. Language has lost its sanctity, and actions have lost their essence. Angels hear the victory drums of the Kauravas and desperate sighs of Pandavas. A voice emerges from the skies. The thunder is clear and vivid. In the flash of lightning, the good hear the faint voices of angels declaring. What angels are saying? Lord has not abandoned you. Lord has not abandoned you. Remember, it is no good being good when evil threatens you. If good is weak, it is weak because it believes in good, and they are trying to do good to the evil also. Here, Krishna, Lord Krishna told them to fight evil and deviate from anything. If you have to tell a lie, that Avasasama moment, it is not out of place. So this was my poem for today. Thank you very much for giving me. I think I overstepped my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jernail Anand. It was very, very deep, I would say, the introduction, and the poetry is so touching. And you really invoke the task of poetry and important social task of poet, that is social transformation. It begins with self and it continues with self, society, and culture.
So now I request Dr. Sushri Sangeeta Mishra ji to share her presentation on the very topics poetry and task for social transformation of self and society.
Thank you, Randir ji, and Dr. Jernail Singh Anand. I was literally mesmerized listening to you, so I'll be probably taking a few seconds to get to my presentation. Professor Giri, all our friends, all the erudite souls and seekers and learners, the co-travelers. So it's a pleasure and honor to be sharing the platform with you all, Dr. Jernail Singh and all of you. Okay, so as I start my presentation, poetry and pathways of self and social transformation. So what I'm going to do is I'll divide my presentation in three parts. I'll try to limit it within each part in 5 to 6 minutes and sum up maybe for 2 minutes so that we are left with some time to for discussion, and I'll get to listen to others as well. And before I begin the presentation, a small offering, a small poem, few lines of a poem which is on poem, which I hope and pray that brings the poetry gets enlivened with it. Randir ji, can you share my presentation? I'm unable to see, there is no sharing.
Okay, I will share.
Yeah. Okay. So the yeah, Jay, read it. Yeah, we can. Okay, we can go to the poem. Poem is titled Odyssey. It searches for itself in acclaims, in splendors, in temple, mosque, church, scriptures, sculptures, touch, smell, vision, wonder, passes through dark tunnels, deep water, jumps into the receiving pit to reach the azure. The search never ends. Sometime it finds the footprints and breaths. Somewhere it sees scattered bits of death's anklets. It never stops anywhere, neither at frozen nor at emptiness. Perhaps this is what its existence is all about, an unending hide and seek between a spark of light and giggling darkness. Sitting still under the efflux of words, it keeps sculpting a figurine of the unseen. Who knows when someone would silently descend into them. Sitting still under the efflux of word, it keeps sculpting a figurine of the unseen. Who knows when someone would silently descend into them and smile in the mirror where truth sits translucent. There, roads may end and journey extends. So I thought this is in line with all that Dr. Singh were just now saying us, and I couldn't help but nodding at almost every sentence that he was saying. So with this, I'll go to the first part of the presentation, and before that, I'll make a read out. Harmony is an elemental calling of existence. You can possibly just take to the next. Harmony is an elemental calling of existence, and conflict is a reality of the world we live in. The interplay between the two are glimpsed through our lives, which is what we know as pain and misery. And the same, when glimpsed through poetry, opens up the pathways for transformation that leads us to overcome the same pain and misery. So With this as the core statement of the presentation, my presentation, I will move to the part 1, and then we'll come back to the statement at the end of the presentation if we have been able to reach this conclusion. So the first part is beyond the play of harmony and disharmony poetry as a pathway for transformative harmony. The recorded history of human civilization has revolved around wars and conflicts. Whether to expand territory or to protect it, whether to grab dominion or to save oneself or the other people from it, conflicts have apparently taken the center stage of the flow of events. Conflict is a consequence of humans' greed to acquire more than what he is entitled to. At macro level, conflict takes the shapes of direct violence like civil war, when human beings try to gain control over other people and their resources, and it takes the shape of natural disaster when human beings try to establish dominion over the nature. And at micro level, it takes the form of indirect and structural violence that emerge from caste, class, gender oppression, poverty, injustice, and exploitation, such as marginalization of those who are already in vulnerable state at the local level and even inside the structure of a family and relations. It is indeed a perplexing subject of study how human beings attack and weaken the existence of the space of others, which is not only critical to the others, but also to themselves, to oneself. As we look deep into it, we examine the development of, the events that has culminated into wars and violence and exploitation of others, it emerges that violence has less to do with the need or greed of resources, but more to do with the desire for acquisition of power and dominion. As reflected by author Stanley Bing, he's a prominent business author, but I feel he's given a lot of socialistic and, if I may say so, poetic insight into his business writing. We incorporate, follow him a lot. Stanley Bing, in his book, the name of the book is the Roman Industries, the Rise and Fall of the First Multinational Corporation, which he has actually compared the Roman Empire as the first multinational corporation of the world. And he wrote, and I quote in his opening statement, "Beneath the surface of all corporate affairs lie the drama of human affairs, the human emotions and human ego." So here we can also recall J. Krishnamurti's word. Philosopher Krishnamurti said, and I again quote, "The source of violence is in me, the ego, the self, which expresses itself in so many ways, in division, in trying to be somebody, which divides itself as me and not me, as the unconscious and the conscious. The me which, that identifies within the family or not with the family, also with the community and not with the community, and so on." Unquote. Thus, the root of violence is in this disharmony and discord within oneself, and that sits at the heart of the problem, the individual and then family, and then moves to the community, society, state, nation, and so on and so forth. The disharmony in self culminates into the disharmony in society. The most prominently visible result of it are the violent wars. However, the biggest casualty of disharmony may not be wars. Wars, alongside all violence, bloodshed, loss, misery, have also brought forth examples of outstanding bravery, sense of service, sacrifice, yearning for peace, and quest for self. Many wars like Kalinga War are the case in point. The biggest casualty of disharmony is the slide in social structure and order that leads to decay in the sense of self and vice versa. Post the Cold War and thereafter, the conditions of less modernities have brought the running page of the history to a dangerous age of humanity, encircled by many problems. environmental violence, alarmingly widened, I wouldn't call it widening, it's widened economic inequality, political bankruptcy, religious fundamentalism, radicalism, rapid technological change that leading to disruptions almost by seconds in all arena, and above all, philosophical confusions. While our access to information now has become high, at the same time, the contradictions in them has actually become higher. The line of distinction between right and wrong, between true and false, is more blurred than ever before. Sociologists have begun to call this time the post-truth era, a term coined in 2016. Never before, perhaps, there has been such an urgency to prepare the society to adapt to a volatile tomorrow and to be able to face so many challenges together, from the worsening shocks of climate change, pandemic, to economic challenges, geopolitical conflict, to heightened state of mental and emotional conflicts at the individual level. This state places before us two possible choices. One, we live with the loss and alienation, and the other one is the reclamation of self and the spirit. We are passing through a phase that it not just necessitates the deepening of human awareness, but also validates it. And at the heart of this process stays the human capacity to reflect upon ourselves, to make the attempt for higher understanding. What would be new if we can find a route, a path, a portal to reflect upon our individual selves at the collective level? And that would be the movement for realization of meaning, coherence, coordination, and joy in self. So can poetry, or is poetry, a portal to that path of transformative harmony? And can we charter that path to enter that portal? I think the answer can come from a deep insight into what poetry does. And that can start, I'm reminded of everything that Dr. Jernail Singh was just now saying, and that can start with deeper understanding of poetry, what poetry is, and more importantly, where it comes from, the very process of the birth of the poetry. And this brings me to my second part of the presentation, that is sense of search, self, and poetry. In the words of Robert Frost, poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a lovesickness. Perhaps more broadly, we can say a sense of wonder. A poetic wonder stems from what one experiences and conceives. The experience may not be necessarily from the event or incident occurring with him or her. It might come from events, incidents, knowledge, information that is received from the surrounding. But what he or she has goes through, and the thoughts and the feelings and the emotion that is generated by that is completely his or hers. The same surrounding, the same situation can actually invoke different emotions or different level of emotions, to say more. This is where begins a search, either at a conscious or at a subconscious level. In the attempt to make sense of the world around, one attempts to make sense of oneself, and the poetic journey begins. But then with that also begins the struggles and the hurdles of poet, which we human beings escape otherwise. As reflected by poet T.S. Eliot, if I quote, poetry may make us from time to time a little more aware of the deeper and unnamed feelings which form the substratum of our being to which we rarely penetrate. For our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves. For our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves. So here we again question, then why do we human beings tend to escape? And what do we evade? Why do we escape thoughts and contemplations? One of the answers could, it's not easy to sustain that layer and glow of self-knowing. The challenges are many. At the portal of self-knowing stands the fact that self is not singular, but plural. There are many number of selves in the self, and they are in conflict and often contradict each other. Looking one's self calls for attending to all of them together. And this is the first and perhaps the biggest challenge. I think here it would be contextual to quote philosopher Krishnamurti again, who vividly explained this reality of human life in very simple terms. We live, I quote, we live in fragment. You are one thing at office and another at home. You talk about democracy in your heart, but inside your heart, you are autocratic. You talk about loving your neighbors, and yet you kill them with computation. I'm reminded of the point that Dr. Jernail Singh was mentioning, living poetry. So we'll come to it. So, okay, I continue the quote. So you are one thing at, so you talk about loving your neighbors, yet you kill them with computation, unquote. So such living has been easy and acceptable. Or rather, we are conditioned by our environment, our society to live like that. But in the process, we lose the sight and awareness of our whole being. The whole being which begins to appear as we explore the self. And this brings me to the third part of my presentation, discovering. We can go to the next slide. Randirji, if you can hear me. And so discovering self through poetry. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Centuries back, Aristotle said this. And the theory of self still remains a challenging and ever-evolving area of study for humankind. Both Eastern and Western knowledge systems have been occupied with self-knowledge and emphasized its importance, particularly citing the paradoxical combination of its immediate simplicity and profound obscurity involved in its pursuit. Philosophers have had different views on searching of self and discovering the self. Rene, for example, believed that self is the only thing that can be known for certain, and that one must doubt everything else in order to truly know oneself. On the other hand, philosophers like David Hume have argued self is nothing more than a collection of perception, and that there is no underlying self to be discovered. Immanuel Kant believed that self is a rational being that can be understood through reasons and observation, but that is ultimately unknowable. Yet more contemporary philosophers like Martin Heidegger have argued that self is not something that can be discovered, rather something that is being constantly created through one's action and experience. I would come back to philosopher Krishnamurti again, who believed the true self-discovery requires a deep and radical understanding of nature of mind and the self. He taught that self is not a fixed entity, but rather it is constantly changing and evolving. He believed that self-awareness is not just a matter of understanding of one's thoughts and emotion, but also of understanding of nature of mind itself. So in essence, we see there are different schools of thoughts, and many philosophers are arguing that, if we can broadly put it in two sides, then possibly we'll find that one side broadly arguing that self is the only thing that can be known for certain, while the other argue that self is ultimately unknowable. And this, I think, is a very critical point for us to understand. And it is at this point that the process of search and seeking becomes more significant than the finding itself. It is in this sense that discovering of self refers to the awareness of the process. When Socrates emphasized that goal of philosophy was to know yourself, that essentially echoes the teachings of the seers of Upanishad, who maintained that ultimate real knowledge involves an understanding of essence of the self. Adi Shankaracharya, in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, said, self-knowledge alone eradicates misery. And self-knowledge alone is the means to the highest bliss, unquote. And so not only philosophers and spiritual seekers, there are possibly many streams of knowledge, including psychology, sociology, neuroscience, have approached the subject from many different angles and aspects, and all have converged at one point that the awareness of the self is non-negotiable requisite for well-being of the self and humanity at large. What then keeps us away from it? What makes the search and the self-discovery of self so challenging, and so that most often it is unreachable? At the heart of this question, I think, lies its answer. It is the cracks between our individual self, social self, and collective self that limits our vision, our capacity to our vision and capacity to comprehend the truth beyond what our eyes can see. I repeat this particular statement. It is the cracks between our individual self, our social self, and our collective self that limits our vision, our capacity, and our capacity to comprehend the truth beyond what our eyes can see. And it is here we turn to converse with ourselves and within ourselves. And one of the forms of those conversations is poetry. And it is here we get to see that poetry is not what it says, but what it does. Poetry expands us at all layers of self, moving towards bridging those gaps and cracks in the layers of our existence. For the conscious self, poetry helps the individual to better understand their own thoughts, feelings, providing a means of self-expression. And for unconscious and subconscious self, poetry serves as a means for accessing and interpreting the unconscious thoughts, feelings, beliefs, notions, and also, most importantly, the embedded and hidden wisdom. For the social self, poetry helps individuals to understand the perspective and experiences of others, and thereby promoting empathy and understanding. And for the spiritual self, poetry prompts and provides a sense of connection to something greater, something greater than oneself, and serves as a means of exploring the spiritual essence of existence as it strives to find the answers to the fundamental questions like birth, death, and existence as a whole. So poetry not only sets us on the path of discovering the self, it also provides the light in which one gains the perspective of self, and that self which is not fragmented but whole. So, in conclusion, I would, so poetry, I mean, this is a part of my finding as I was, researching into the subject. Poetry of all genres, all forms, all culture, are initially sparked by a sense of search, essentially the search of self. In some poetry, the search and the seeking is evident, and in some cases, they are not. When we look deep into our poetic journey and their body of work, we can get to see a larger but a single truth. That is, behind all poetic expression, there is a deep yearning and undeniable need for love, justice, peace, and harmony. And this truth is not limited only to the literary expression, poetic expression, but it extends to all literary activities. That is, which includes reading and thinking and having quest for knowledge, which is what again we call living poetry. And for those who love to read poetry and immerse themselves in reading poetry, it is like looking into a mirror to search oneself. As one reads deeply and tries to gain the perception of self, one experiences that transformation. He or she moves closer to the truth that leads her to the harmony with self and thereby with the surrounding, and thus the harmony is passed on from the poet to the reader, to the surrounding, and ultimately to the society at large. So with these words, I would stop my presentation, and I have few more lines of a poem to offer, but maybe after we listen from others.
Thank you, Sushri Sangeeta Mishra ji. It was really a very enriching and insightful talk, and beautifully you engaged the post for philosophical insight, and with reference to the orientation of poet and his or her poetry. So I request discussant of today's session, Anand to give a remark of around 7 to 8 minutes, and then we'll invite persons to have questions.
Thank you, Sushri Appa. Thank you, Randhir, Dr. Anand, and all friends co-present, awake till 10 o'clock. And that reminds me a thought from Bhagavad Gita. And the line goes like this: Jasyang jagarti bhutani sa nisa pasyato mune. So when everybody is sleeping, it is the Muni who are awake. And when everybody is awake, the Muni is in sleep. In the sense that when the whole society seems to be sleeping, the poet is awake. But one fundamental question is, of course, to understand what Sushri Appa is saying, what Dr. Anand has said, I would very quickly offer three thoughts. One is from the philosopher Charles Taylor, who says that the poetry is a performative force, and that can be related to living poetry that Dr. Anand has spoken about. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, who thought poetically, and he thought with the poetry of Hölderlin. And Hölderlin thinks about a time when the gods and the human beings would walk on earth together. So Heidegger says that it is not history which is the foundation, but poetry is the foundation of history. But to this we can say this foundation in that sense, not in a genealogical sense, but in a continuous sense of co-presence. It is poetry which is a co-constitutive, co-creative element in us. But one self-critical question is, no matter what we speak about poetry, then as there was a mention about examples, that all these talks about the poet or the anti-poet, the fact of the matter is that what we do as poets individually, as Sushri Appa was saying, that the real challenge is that how do we bring individual reflection at the collective level? One self-critical question is that anything that we speak about, anything, like Dr. Anand says, that poetry is the expression of truth. Poetry cannot be corrupted. But is it really so? Right from the beginning to the medieval time, where there were court poets, now many of the poets, they wrote poetry, but they wrote in the name of the kings. So therefore, there is also a reality of the poetry in the sense that how poetry has compromised itself with powers that be. And today we see in our contemporary political climate, there are many poets also who sing uncritically about the so-called new God that is there. Therefore, anything that speaks about poetry, it has to be spoken with a lot of, self-criticality. And therefore, how do we understand the dynamics of the poetry in self-culture and society? And any thought that we begin with, it is an invitation for us in multiple ways. One is a heuristic sense, just to open up, that is poetry really a dynamics of truth? If so, how does it really interact with multiple untruth? And secondly, as a path of self and social transformation. And therefore, we also need to speak about the community of poets. And finally, what Chittavai has said, that he expresses a hope that the Kabira Vasana, the poet, the aspiration of the poet is that the poet would weave a relationship of intimacy. It is an invitation, but the question is, do we all really give ourselves to the task of weaving the threads of intimacy? And weaving that thread is a revolutionary task, because our existing systems of society are based not on intimacy, but on a kind of power struggle that Sushri was referring to. So thank you, and I look forward to further conversations with this, please.
Thank you, Anantavai, as always, very, very deep, and you really invites us to engage with the transformative task of the poetry and the poet. And you beautifully brought the idea of Martin Heidegger, and that is something which I also tried to find from the sociology of literature, that where the social position as a writer or as a thinker or as a poet, we think. And so thank you so much, and I request respected participant to raise his or her hand to have a further discussion and dialogue. I invite Professor Gyan Gului, and then we can invite other participant also. Yes, Dr.
Yes.
Gyan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Am I audible? Because I have
Yes,
a strange
you
sound. It was really very interesting, and I was thinking about different points. What perhaps in this moment most interests me is the way in which the individual self can reach or can go nearer, at least, to the social self, to the collective self, through poetry also, not only through poetry, but also through poetry. Because, well, our first impression when, and not only the first impression that we have when we see reality and see the self or the sociality in society, we see a kind of separation between individuals, a sort of separation between us, between the individual self and the society. And only the second time, after a long process of education, also formation, perhaps can we see that the social self and the reality is not so distant from us. It is something of us, and we are something, we individuals are something of the social self. That is, that there is not necessarily a strong separation or a separation which cannot anyway be eliminated or at least be diminished. This separation is in our minds, but it can be diminished. Now, of course, poetry can have this role, can have a role of bringing individuals next to each other, nearer to each other, at least, and poetry can let people, the individuals understand that they are not so rigid, monadic, separated individuals, but that there is a layer which on closer inspection unites them. I think one of the role and functions which poetry can have is precisely this duty to bring the individuals next to each other. That is, poetry has, in my opinion, this role of education, of bringing the individuals to another dimension, which is not immediately given to their minds and to their conception of reality, but because I think at the beginning we see the reality as something separated, the society as something separated from us, divided irremediably, without remedy divided. And only poetry and only other forms of education and meditation, of course, can bring us to a different conception of society, of course, of reality and of nature also. It's something which is not completely different from us. It's something which may not be used by us. It's something which with which we are on close inspection a unity. And this is my reflection about poetry, transformation of the self, transformation of the individual self, because of course this process of education is a transformation, it's a complete transformation of the self, of his disposition, attitudes, disposition towards reality, visions of reality, interpretations of reality. That is from a passage, really a transformation from a divided I, from the reality, to a united I, united self with reality. This is so my conception of poetry, and this is what it came to my mind while listening at the, of course, very brilliant exposition and ideas. And therefore, I thank you very much. It was really very, very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gyan. Nominti Pradhanji.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ranveer. Thank you so much, Professor Jernail Singh, Anand, and Sushri Opa. If I take the liberty to call you, so very beautiful presentation. I wish we would have some more time and we would have discussed a little more about it. And Jernail Singh Anand sir was telling, no, there are a few things, what it was like you experiencing everything as first person. Like I will highlight few things. He was telling no earning from income or from verses. When you say you are a poet, people say that's fine, but what you do? That has never been considered as a, it's a profession. That is like a part-time pastime. Nice hobby. Some will call it nice hobby. But and as he was talking about the hypocrisy, the people who write, sir, one thing I would like to tell that you were talking about academic poetry and the prompts. Actually, no, those prompts sometimes pushes you out of your comfort zone, and we just go out of our way and we just write few things. Then that later again we'll join here, Sushri Opa's. When you join, that was a self-discovery. Yes, I could do this, and I could do it very well also. At a point, I feel sometimes it's like that. So I will just share few things, how the poetry joins the 7 centers of our consciousness. That is there are the security center, like which one we, first thing it goes like food, shelter, water, family, friends, and general emotions. The first poetry starts with that what we observe in and around. So it joins to the first center, that is the security center. Then second comes the sensory center, that is the enjoyment of the life reaches and the ups and downs of life. It encourages the pleasurable activities to where you capture it more into your words. The third one is the power center, both internal and external terms of power, from like the influence, the gain of goal, then where humility is very important. I mean, in my life, I try everywhere to write a poetry to connecting to every emotions and every situation, every object, like. So I could connect it into the 7th center of consciousness. Then comes the love center. That is the interpersonal relationships, where you love yourself, you strengthen your input and output and the empathetic responses. If I'm in others' shoe, how it will be. Or then comes the cornucopia center, the sense and consciousness. Then 6th comes the self-awareness center, which coordinates with the personality to understand better the world around you. And the last one is the cosmic awareness center, which Sir was talking, even Sushri Opa was talking about the self, the universe, and the infinite beauty of universe and becoming one with the cosmos. So these are the things to write poetry. And metaphorically, whatever language we use for the poetry, it is always, it is a affective perspective. I mean, you can take language as a stimulant, as a flow of consciousness, and a discussion probably moving from one statement to other, as well as connection. It gives the connection of, seems to occur intuitively while you read a poetry. And it always triggers an analytical thinking, perceive the language sensory motor level. In the close reading, it helps us to go through all these things. And as Sushri Opa, always I have seen, she has been done her poetry writing research, and her speeches all about poetry and philosophy. Mine has been a little bit different perspective, how it affects one psychologically, how it affects the society, as you were telling, individual, self-individual, social, and collectively, how it affects. This has been my point of research, a little bit about it, and still the journey is on. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I request Dr. Sushri Opa to share her thought on these reflections and queries.
Thank you, Randirji. So, just to sum up, I think we are going close to our closing time. So I'll try to keep it short, maybe possibly 2 minutes. Yes, I'll start from what Dr. Ganluiji was saying, that yes, one of the biggest challenges, that sense of separation and the understanding of the fact that there is no separation. So yes, this is a challenge in our life, and poetry is in a constant, poetry, I would rather think, is a constant journey that to meet that challenge. And in that sense, that is the very sense of existence of poetry. As poetry begins from that yearning and the sense. And as Minati was saying, very nicely explained, the 7 centers of and how poetry actually touches each center and each sphere of life and our living, up to the highest of the conscious. I think, and yes, one of the, and yes, that's very beautifully explained by Anand Bhai. I think he summed up, entire presentation of mine at the general sense in very few words. I think before, more than saying anything, we can possibly conclude with a poem, which will talk a little more on poetry, which will give us the essence of poetry, because all of us here have now, at the end of the presentation, at the end of the conversation, have one thing that has emerged common and very clearly, that poetry essentially is a conversation with our, with our inner self and with our conscious. And so I think, and it is the essence of existence. Yet poetry and poets struggle socially, and like Minati was saying, from the psychology. So with that, with that thought and sense, I would offer few lines of a poem, and I think that would probably one of the best way to conclude the session ahead of the International Poetry Day, which is day after tomorrow. And this poem can actually be dedicated to all the poets ever born, ever worked on the earth, all those who wrote poetry and all those who did not write poetry, all those who lived poetry. And the title of the poem is Truth. I have walked very long on the rocky bed of the earth, embracing the sand, the soil, the sod, the clod, in my effort to excavate truth. In my effort to excavate truth, many times I have fallen into the pit where truth sits complacent, refusing to be rescued. For truth, since for truth, earth is trivial. I repeat, I have walked very long on the rocky bed of the earth, embracing the sand, the soil, the sod, the clod. In my effort to excavate truth, many times I have fallen into the pit where truth sits complacent, refusing to be rescued, since for truth, earth is trivial. Many a times I have fallen into the bottomless depth, yet defying death, I have risen from the shadows of my own. Aeons have passed, I still carry on. This is just once more that I would look for origin before this is just once more that I would look for my origin before I get up and walk again. Only a few questions to be triggered at random, sitting at the mouth of the cannon. My words would tremble, my silence would echo in me for a while. This is just once again that a drop of tear would be left for its fossil to be found under the frozen time. So each poem is that drop of tear which is left for time and which is gifted to given to posterity. And it's not only that that poetry, those words, but also the way of living, way of thinking, and the craving for reaching the collective self. With that, I stop. I think Randhir ji can.
Randhir, may I read one poetry for 1 minute?
Please.
Yes. Okay, this poem it has been part of an anthology. So it is a Missing Heart. So as we will celebrate after one day the World Poetry Day. So this is how can I go without reading one poetry.
We can't conclude without your poetry.
Not like that, but I just a eagerness to share. Did you find my heart? Did you find my heart? Because it is in the flowing water of the rivers, or maybe in the babbling brooks. It can also be in the depth of the ocean. Did you find my heart? It is amidst the dense forest, in the lush green bushes of the valley, or maybe atop of the tallest trees. Did you find my heart? It is in the chirping of birds. It is in the wings of butterflies, moving and crawling among moving and crawling animals. Did you find my heart? I am in love with the moon, each star in the sky, the sun, galaxy, and Milky Way. Did you find it? Did you find my heart? It is among the maddening crowd, all around the beautiful world and the beautiful beautiful journey called life. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinati. Beautiful.
Thank you. It was a very insightful session. I got inspired by the poetry of Minti Pradhanji and Sushri Appaji. So, celebration of Poetry Day, I would like to share from the movie Dead Poets Society. It goes like that: we don't read and write poetry because it is cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion and medicine, law, business, engineering. These are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. So this is the kind of invitation for all of us to join poetry. Poetry, I mean the becoming of philosophy. And philosophy penetrated by the unconscious means, arriving at the point where philosophy is necessarily poetry, savor poetry of its own producer, inscription of its own surface, as Deleuze says. So with this insightful invitation, we are very thankful for this excellent session. So I request Minti Prajan ji to offer a vote of thanks for this.
Thank you, Randhir. Thank you. I, Minati Pradhan, on behalf of Swadhyaya Sahachakra and Vishwanidam Center for Asian Blossoming, would like to thank for today's session to our respected esteemed guest, today's chair, Professor Jernail Singh Anand ji, for being present with us and giving his very valuable inputs and sharing his thoughts with us. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to thank today's chief speaker, Dr. Sushri Mishra, for her beautiful presentation and beautiful poetry as always. Thank you, Sushri so much for devoting one session to us. Today also, I would like to thank our moderator and our mentor, Professor Anand Kumar Giri, for giving us the opportunity to learn so many things about poetry. Thank you, Anant Bhai. I would like to thank Professor Ganluji. Like every time, he shares his valuable inputs and be present with us in our journey. Thank you, sir, so much. I would like to thank all our online platform participants and the Facebook platform participants for being present with us. Please pardon me if I've forgotten anybody's name. at the end, not the last, at the last, I would like to thank our convener Randhir Kumar Gautam for conducting and today sharing a beautiful poem and executing all these webinars so well. Thank you, Randhir, and thank you all. Good night.
And thanks is due to you all.